I about had a crisis today. Actually, I had a temporary crisis. So at lunch, I don't normally do this, but at lunch I was going to look over my lesson on my iPad, and I couldn't find it. I had brought my MacBook with me. I said, well, let me check my MacBook, because that's where I actually do all my editing on. It wasn't there. Trash can was empty. It was on the cloud. I'd been on iCloud, so I went on iCloud. Recently deleted, because I'd only worked on it a little bit over the weekend. So I knew there was nothing recently deleted. I said, oh no. So I had one last thing, because fortunately it was on iCloud. You could go recover, and within 30 days, try recovery mode, or try to find it. Fortunately, it was there, and so I got it recovered. Then I saved the backup to another place, so in case something happened again. But at least I was afraid tonight I don't know what I was going to do. Because like I said, I have copied a lot of some of these sayings down from the ancient writings, and I didn't want to spend time. Let me look and see if I find it here, We might have gotten to 1 point, and then I say 1 point, 1/2 of 1 point of one, something like that. So fortunately I have it. So last week we began looking at Josephus. We spent a lot of time looking at his background. First century Jew, born in Jerusalem, AD 37. Parents were both parents were of the tribe of Levi. His father was a priest. Supposedly, his father was highly regarded. Some have said that maybe he put this in there because he himself there was some doubt about his history, and so in his life of Flavius Josephus, he put it. But his father was a priest, and we point this out for a little bit, that when he was about 14 years of age, he knew a lot about, he knew so much about the law and the Talmud, the Talmud wasn't officially in existence, but the traditions, that the priest and the principal men of the city would come to him when they had questions. We point out how that parallels a little bit about Jesus, does it not, in some sense, but it's a little different. I was listening to a podcast put out by the Gospel Broadcasting Network, The Authentic Christian, and interestingly, they talk about the raising of a child. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, what they did in the various stages of a child. And after hearing what they said a little bit, and it didn't go in a great deal, wasn't, the whole podcast wasn't about it, but I have even more doubts about what he said. Of course, he could have been, like I said, a boy genius or a prodigy or Doogie Howser, but it's interesting when he wrote about himself. Then he talked about how he decided to try to join one of the three sects, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. He ended up joining the Pharisees. At age 26, he went to Rome. There he was impressed by the Romans. Then he headed back to Palestine, to Canaan in 66 AD. There he became like a leader of the forces in Galilee. We pointed out a situation where he and some other Jews were besieged by the Romans, and they decided to kill themselves. Josephus wasn't exactly the most adamant proponent of that, but he agreed. But of course, somehow, and I don't know exactly, I don't remember how I hadn't really gotten to that point in my reading, but I don't remember how they did it, but supposedly it was some kind of draw. He got down to one of the last two, and the last two, he and this other gentleman decided it would be better to be captured by the Romans. And so he was, and they were probably going to execute him. Then he made some statement, supposedly to Vespasian, general who was leading the armies of Rome at the time, that he and his son Titus would one day be emperors. And that caught their attention. Was he some sort of prophet? And so, of course, what happens? Vespasian does become emperor. A little bit after that time, does that mean that Josephus God had come down and inspired him as a prophet? Or did he, because of his visitation to Rome, because just some basic knowledge, read the so-called tea leaves, we might say, and understand what the political situation was? I'm going to go with the latter, that he had some understanding, because if Nero was nearing the end and then someone's going to take over, one of the better candidates would be what? The general of the Roman army. A general of the Roman army, so we do know that. He was with the Romans when they besieged Jerusalem, supposedly tried to convince them to give up, but of course we know what happened there. Then after that, he became really associated with the Flavian family, Vespasian, Titus, who was the next emperor, Vespasian's son, and then Domitian, who of course in 96 AD was emperor when John was exiled to Patmos. Known for 4 writings: the Jewish War, the Antiquities of the Jews, or the Jewish Antiquities, the Life of Flavius Josephus, and Against Appian. Occasionally there's some other writing that comes up, but generally these are the 4 associated. I did not bring that Josephus book, as I said I would not, and of course you saw that. Very thick book, very, very thick book. So he wrote a lot. So the question then we asked was, did Josephus reference Jesus in his writings? So we looked at the Antiquities of the Jews, book number 18, chapter 3, verse 3. I'm not exactly sure how the latter designations are, but it's book 18, chapter 3. And we read this. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among him, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Now, the Antiquities are generally given a date, I think, around 94, 95, 93, 95 AD, sometime last century of the first century, last decade of the first century. And if you read that, and of course this is in the article, they took this passage, what does it sound like? Well, first of all, what?
Sounds like the gospel.
Sounds like the gospel. That's a good way to put it. And that Josephus wrote it down, and so obviously he announces that he is the Christ. If it be lawful to call a man, there's 1 or 2 ways you could look at it that way, that he was lower than a man or higher than a man. And based upon what we see, if he was the Christ, then obviously he'd be higher than the man. And he arose from the grave, and he appeared to them after he died. It does sound like the gospel. And so critics of this verse, or this passage, will make the claim that either all of the passage was added later, or at least that some of the passage was added. For example, if it be lawful to call him a man, he was Christ. He appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. So things like this were added. And then there are some that would say, this is actually what Josephus wrote. So, what's the case? one of the arguments you'll get into is with regard to the writing style. One of the difficulties that we have, as allow me to use the secular term that sometimes lay persons, is we're reading in a translated language. We're not reading in the original. This is one of those cases where if you could read the original, understand the original, you might get a better handle on the style, this and that. And we understand that people can write, teachers who have their students all year can generally do what with regard to their writing? Those like English teachers or history teachers that maybe have them write papers. What can they tell a lot of times? Plagiarism. Did somebody else write? Maybe it's not plagiarism, but somebody else wrote it for them. Just the way the language, the type of words used, the flow of the language that's used, the grammar, it sounds different. So a lot of times you can tell, sometimes you can tell these things. Of course, we also know that, as it's been said, I like this saying, and I like I'm not an English major, I'm not an English writer, I wish I wrote better. It takes a lot of skill to write. Of course, today a lot of writers have editors, and there's a lot of things that go behind the scene, to get to that book on there. But, the saying goes, I'm sorry I wrote you such a long letter. I wanted to write you a short letter, but I didn't have the time. Meaning that to really write a short, concise, to the point letter does what? It requires thought, it requires editing, it requires just there. So the argument with regard to the language style, you have to sometimes take what the commentators say, and you sort of have to take it with a grain of salt, or just say, these people probably know more about it if they're familiar with the language than I do. Now, some would claim that the language doesn't agree. You read some would claim that the language doesn't, does fit Josephus' writings. And of course, one thing we do have is we have a lot of Josephus' writings, do we not? So the language that's used many would claim that does fit. So I bring that up just to point out, that's an argument that's made, to me it's a difficult argument sometimes for us to apply because like I said, there's some semantics there that we just have to deal with. I'll give one quick example and I'll get you, Seth. For example, 1st and 2nd Peter, a lot of times they say, well, 1 Peter has one style and 2 Peter has another style. And of course, that might be the case. And of course, writing a letter to your mother, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your husband, somebody might be handled differently than writing a term paper or writing a technical document or a thesis or something like that. Or if you're writing, here's a good one, if you're a writer, some historians, if you're a writer that is going to write academic papers that are going to be read by your peers, that's going to be written in a style that if you want to write for a broader audience. David McCulloch, Stephen Ambrose, modern popular historians, they sell a lot of books. If they wrote it in the style that you would write for their peers, for all historians, they wouldn't sell many books because they're boring and dry. So it can be done. It's not impossible. Yes, Seth?
Are they saying that Josephus added it later or somebody else added it in?
Somebody else, like Christians are generally the ones accused. Some Christian added these passages. Not Josephus necessarily. So we've just briefly talked about the style. Again, I'm not an expert on that, and I can't make too much judgment there. Like I said, I read some other passages. I don't notice much difference there. But again, I'm not reading in the original language necessarily. One argument that's used is that some of the early Christian writers, especially those who were apologetics, apologetic writers, would be considered apologetic writers, they said they did not use Josephus' writings when defending the deity of Christ. And the idea might be, well, boy, if you had this passage here, wouldn't you use that as some kind of defense? The writers were in question for Justin Martyr, life 100 to 165 AD, Tertullian 160 to 240 AD, and Origen 185 to 253 AD, or some of the ones. They did not write it. Later writers, Eusebius, 4th century writer, did. Origen did, though, make a note that Josephus did not believe Jesus to be the Messiah. In a writing from his Contra Celsum, now, let me read this, it's a little lengthy. For in the 18th book of the Antiquity of the Jews, Josephus bears witness to John as having been a Baptist and as promising purification to those who underwent the rite. Now this writer, and please note, Origen is referencing Josephus, referencing John, what we call John the Baptist. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now this writer, although not believing in Jesus as the Christ, and seeking after the cause of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, whereas he always said that the conspiracy against Jesus was the cause of these calamities befalling the people, since they put to death Christ, who was a prophet, says nevertheless, being, although not against his will, not far from the truth, that these disasters happened to the Jews as a punishment for the death of James the Just, who was a brother of Jesus called Christ. The Jews, having put him to death, although he was a man most distinguished for his justice. Paul, a genuine disciple of Jesus, says that he regarded Jesus as a brother of the Lord, not so much on account of their relationship by blood or their being brought up together as because of his virtue and doctrine. So he does reference, he does say that he does not believe Jesus is the Messiah. So what does that maybe tell me? He does reference Antiquity of the Jews, so that he did have some knowledge of Antiquities of the Jews, whether that he had read it himself or whether he had got it from other passages, other writings maybe. So he was familiar by this time. Some would say, well, maybe these men didn't have access to the writings. The one that I would say of the three, Justin Martyr from 100 to 165, may be the most likely candidate and may not have. And I know this sounds a little boring, but some might say, well, why would you say that? Well, keep in mind, so today, she doesn't do it anymore, I guess. J.K. Rowling, a number of years ago, wrote a number of books by some guy named Harry Potter. And she wrote a book. She wrote it out. She got done with it, and she was wanting to sell another copy. So what did she do? She got by hand and she rewrote that same book. And so she sold millions and millions, and so she had to write each one by hand in order to sell it. That's not the case, is it? Today, what happens? Today, they would have put that on some web server, they'd put it somewhere on the internet or on a computer-based servers or something like this, and they would have hit print, and all this would have, these fancy machinery would have come through, and they could just print as many copies as they want. And so that's why she could sell a lot of books like that, or there are a lot of books available. So when Apologetics Press prints this Bible, has this Bible printed, it takes a lot of effort, does it not? But Eric Lyons and Kyle Butt on in there, getting a little typewriter, typing, here, Chad's future, order the Bible. Eric, you better get the typing, get that book, we'll get it then we'll get it bound. No, they do it there. While the first century, and by this time you had scribes in this, what happened? Josephus writing, as the history of the Jews, writing as some assignment or partially for the benefit of his Roman benefactors, we might say, for their benefit as well. He writes this, And Domitian would have been the one in charge, so at the time, he looks at it and says, I'd like 100 copies. Couldn't go down to the computer, couldn't even go down to the Xerox machine, using a 1970s term, the photocopier, and do that. Somebody had to write this by hand. And so it might take a while to, for copies to be, to get out. Because first of all, someone's going to have to copy them. Second of all, there has to be interest in the topic, does it not? I can write, I want to write a book on some minor league baseball team in North Dakota from the 1960s. It might be a great book. I might say, boy, that's really interesting. Nobody might want my book. So what would I not want to do? I wouldn't want to print a lot of copies. So again, it takes time. So someone like Justin Martyr, his writings, there may not have been a copy or copies. Who was doing the copy? How did they get it? One group who probably didn't copy a lot of Josephus' writings were the Jews. And part of the reason they wouldn't have done it is because they thought he was a traitor. And so, hey, do we really want to copy? Like I said, we saw that book, Hughes' book. Do we want to spend the time copying? We got other things we can copy. So it may have been hard, may have taken time for copies of this writing to get out. Again, by the time of Origen, it does appear that it was. So, takes time. The Jews aren't interested in copying. Who's copying it? Another thing may have been that because Josephus was not liked by the Jews, again, copying of the writings wouldn't have been copied. Also, there may not have been the thought process in using his writing because he was disliked by the Jews. Yes, I realize Christians by later were more Gentile than Jew, and that had been separated. That Christianity was not a sect of the Jews; it was something new. But there could have been some idea of not using Josephus' writing for that. Another thing that you'll see is the idea that these earlier writers were more inclined to use the Old Testament as a source to defend Jesus and Christianity. To use the Old Testament. And is that understandable? Yes. Because, what was that?
Isaiah 53.
That's right. Isaiah 53. Great passage to use. And think about all the prophecies. And we think about the gospel accounts and the prophecies around there. And so here we are. We're trying to defend it. Could we defend, I don't know if they would have done this. Again, they wouldn't have used Josephus. If they were more inclined, they would have probably used some of Josephus' writings, I would say, that were from the Old Testament that may have supported some of the things of the Old Testament. I'm a little wary about that. I don't believe that necessarily. But if you're going to use the Old Testament, you're going to use the writings of the Jews, what we call the Jews, the Old Testament writings, the Hebrew writings, and you're less inclined to use non-historical writings, or excuse me, non-Christian writings, that's the wrong way to use it. I could see that they would not use a writings of Josephus, even if he made a statement like he did in Antiquities 18:3 and 3. So there's some reasons why the early apologetics writers would not have used Josephus. Although again, we point out Origen did appear to be familiar with Josephus' writings. He doesn't reference this passage necessarily, but he does reference a couple other passages. But he also notes that he did not believe that Christ was the Messiah. And let's one other thing to point out. Did Jesus ever reject support for his being the Son of God from some entities? Yes, he did. When demons, the devils, would do what? They say what you will about, and they acknowledge what? That Jesus was the Christ. And Jesus didn't like that. Jesus didn't, they knew the situation. He did not want to hear that. So sometimes, even if somebody is speaking the truth, but they are an enemy, or as Origen says, maybe a pagan. If Josephus was really enamored with the Roman way of life, in all likelihood he was worshiping Roman gods, and if he may have been a paganistic Jew, whatever, but he wasn't a Christian. And so maybe that support's not the kind of support you really need. You got to be careful sometimes in what statements are being used by non-Christians, you might say. And so, like I said, Jesus, Paul did not want to hear the young woman in Philippi, or Philippi. That was my GPS. I was driving around trying to get to Sister Carver's on Saturday. Used the GPS. It said Philippi. I said Philippi, and I looked. I said that's Philippi. So I don't know how my GPS starts speaking Philippi. Then it got me thinking about that a little bit later. But you know, that woman in Philippi, he cast her out. He was tired. You know, but what was she saying? Paul is a servant of the Most High God. It was the truth. But Paul didn't want people to hear about the gospel that way. He wanted to hear from the truth, the true gospel, not from a demon-possessed woman. So it's not impossible that people say that may not be the best support. Maybe what Josephus wrote was true, but maybe that's not the best support when trying to defend Christ or defend Christianity. Yes, Seth?
So did Christ make those pigs run into the sea? Or did they do that?
They did. I think they did that on their own, I think. They did that on their own, I believe. We believe that. And so then, sometimes people would say it would be strange that non-Christians could make the statement. At the same time, that's not impossible, is it? Especially if we examine the statements or look at it more closely. So, and again, some of this comes with translations. It'd be interesting if I really understood the original, what actually it said. I'll take what we find here to be pretty close. But sometimes what gets lost, what gets lost in translation sometimes? What you intend to say, or how you've intended to say it. Byron, a few weeks ago, talking about 2 Corinthians, made a reference. Paul was being what? Anybody remember what he said? He said at the beginning. Sarcastic. So Katie was awake when that said it. Thank you. I couldn't remember. I was asleep at the time. No. But it was interesting. Sometimes we just read the Bible. Sometimes we if we're not careful, we miss some of those things. We miss points of sarcasm or cynicism, or occasionally, if we're not careful, if we just read it. If we read something, we might pick up some things. But to be fair, it's hard sometimes to catch those things. And so Josephus, and please note, he wouldn't have been the only one that we can find. I can find an example in the New Testament as well, who may have just been conveying, or we can talk about this, conveying what those followers, that tribe of Christians, thought. What did they think? That he was more than God, more than man, excuse me. That he was Christ. That he was he had risen from the dead. That's what they thought. And he's just reporting it. That's not a, so then, wait a minute, you're talking about sarcasm. What might have been another thing that he could have done? He could have written it to offend some people. Who might he have offended? The Jews, the Sadducees. If they read that, if it wasn't there, they might have read it. What would their thought have been? Would they have been happy? No, they wouldn't have. And if he did not care for them after some 20 or so years, he could have very easily said, I'll put this in here. In one sense, he could say, if someone asked, well, that's what some people thought. That's what you could say. And that's why I put it in there. But he could have been saying,
Could be a bit.
yeah. And he could be just thumbing his nose at the Jews. I meant this one. Did somebody else sort of thumb their nose at the Jews with regard to Jesus being the king of the Jews? Pilate did. Did Pilate really believe that Jesus Christ was the king of the Jews? I don't know. I doubt it. He probably realized that Jesus was more than a normal man. I think he saw some things there. But was he really? But what did he do? It doesn't say this, but he really, I can picture Pilate possibly putting that up as partially to say, this is what I believe. You're going to have to, you don't like it, so be it. You're the one that brought them to me. You messed up my day, and so I'm going to put this up here, whether you like it or not. And that's what he did. Now, was his intent to offend the Jews? I don't know. But I picture that a little bit. I can see somebody who has spent all day with this problem that when he woke up that morning was not his problem. He had probably his mind to other things. And now they brought it up here. Well, okay, I'm going to put this on there. We don't like it. It's tough. And like I said, so that's something that's a possibility. And so that's quite possible that Josephus may have done this. This is a place where he could really, if the Jews didn't like him, they thought he was a traitor, again, he could put this in here, and like I said, he could make the argument, well, these Christians, what do they think? They think he's the Christ. And the statements that he made, even if we took out the ones that were highlighted, we pointed this last week, allow me just to read this without those statements. Now there was about this time Jesus a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to himself both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. Take those out, what do you still have? Jesus was a historical person, and what he said here does agree with the history that we find in the gospel, in the book of Acts, and the New Testament, does it not? There's nothing there that disagrees with that. So it is quite possible that even if it was, some of these parts were added, that you take those out, you still have a true account of Jesus. Not as detailed maybe, but still a true account is that he is an historical person. In 1972, Professor Shlomo Pines of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem translated this statement that we've been reading from an Arabic manuscript. The translation read as follows. I'll read this a little slow, hopefully. At the time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders. So what are some differences from this and then what we read earlier? Well, one was the removal of, if indeed we should call him a man. So that was not found here. A doer of marvelous wonderful deeds. The statement really deals more with conduct and virtue. The idea that he was Christ, and we found the first one, this translation, perhaps he was the Messiah. Okay. He appeared to them on the third day that Josephus wrote. In this translation, of this Arabic manuscript, they reported that he had appeared to them. The fine prophets and 10,000 wonders changed to concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders. So the changes are slight, and the changes there. But what does that change? These changes do? Again, does not deny Christ, does it? What does it say, though? Well, this Christ lived, he died. There's some things about him that were said by some people. So perhaps he was the Messiah. And please note, I'll just make this comment. After the destruction of Jerusalem, the way the Jews look for the Messiah changed. They're really not looking, no matter what some people, they're not really looking for an actual Messiah, as I understand it now. It's more of a thought process or some nations that but it's not, they've stopped really looking, except maybe some radical sects, they've stopped really looking for their Messiah. So perhaps he was the Messiah, and just this. But that's not the same thing as saying he was Christ or he was the Messiah. But again, that could be a statement of truth. That's what was being said by some, you know. We can find passages. He is the Messiah. Well, was he born in, how can the Messiah be being born in Galilee? He's supposed to be born in Bethlehem. Well, you know, this one, go to some other things there. But, you know, there were some who thought he was the Messiah. Or he appeared to them on the third day. The definite nature that we find that statement of Josephus, they reported. So what could that mean? Well, he didn't appear to them, but there were people that said he was. And so we go to the writings, and we find in the New Testament, he appeared to them on the third day, after the third day. Well, it doesn't, this is not a passage to support the gospel account. I'm not saying, if this translation is what Josephus wrote or something, he's definitely writing not with the idea that he really believes in it, does it? But again, the things that are said do match up with the historical account. We believe that Jesus rose from the grave from the third day and appeared to people on the third day, did he not? Someone says, well, that really didn't happen, but there were people that said that. That still doesn't deny the fact that that was said. And we find it in the writings in the New Testament. Here, when Matthew wrote, when Mark wrote, when Luke wrote, when John wrote, what are they saying? Jesus appeared as third day. So there were people that believed it. So that doesn't deny that. And the idea he is divine prophets and 10,000 wonders changed to concerning whom the prophets told wonders. Yes, you know, well, that's really not the fulfillment of the Old Testament. That's not, you know, no, but there were people who thought so. Again, this translation, you take out those passages we're talking about. It does not deny the historical nature of Christ. This Arabic translation makes it more of, well, Jesus existed and then some people exaggerated. But again, still, what's the case? Jesus existed. And the lesson is the historical Christ. We have people today that are real, that things get exaggerated, do they not? George Washington did not do a number of the things that he said, did he? That Washington Irving, some of the things we hear about, they were made up. But does that mean that George Washington didn't exist? I cannot tell a lie. I cut down the cherry tree, you know. Does that, if that didn't happen, does that still mean that George Washington didn't exist? We wouldn't say that, would we? Because there's other evidence, just as there other evidence. And the statement that these are made may deny the supernatural in this statement, this Arabic translation, And so we're not looking at the supernatural part here. We're looking at the historical part with regard to the history in that section, his existence, and it does exist. It does still give support from his existence. Now, if this is the only time Jesus was referenced, then that might be an issue with regard to Jesus. But in the Jewish Antiquities, chapter 20, book 20, we read of this. In the middle of it, it's a link, so I'll just read this. Festus was now dead. What Festus was that, by the way? If you answer the deputy on Gunsmoke, you get a thumbs down. Or a thumbs up. I appreciate that reference. That's not a bad one. But the Festus is actually the one who appeared before Paul. So this gives us some idea of when Josephus is writing. This is after Paul went back, after his third missionary journey, and after he'd gone to Rome, and then, he'd been carried away to Caesarea, and then he went to Rome. It's after this or this. So Festus is now dead, and Albinus was upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them, and this is what he writes, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others for some of his companions. And when he was informed of accusation against them as breakers of law, he delivered them to be stoned. Talking about the death of James, the brother of Christ, an elder in Jerusalem. There's Jesus who was called Christ. Well, again, if chapter 18 hadn't been there, it appears that no one makes the accusation necessarily that somebody wrote in who was the Christ here. Because what does it say? It doesn't say he was a Christ. If you read it, you'll say he who was called Christ. Well, people can get called names. That doesn't mean that they're there. So it's not saying Josephus again believed he was the Christ, but right, he says, who is this James? Well, he's the brother of Jesus. Well, what Jesus? Well, the one that sometimes people will call Christ. And we went back all the way to the beginning. Remember how we talked about some people think like the New Testament was built over layers by Paul, for example. Paul's the one who really got it going. And Paul started with the epistles, and then he went to some more epistles, some other epistles were written. The last thing that was written was the gospel accounts. And yet Paul really didn't know what he was doing, but yet he brings up James in his epistles, who was the brother of Christ. I really don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to put this character in. It's terrible. It's awful. So James appears, and so what we're saying is, so Paul made that up? If Paul made that up, then so is Josephus in referencing a fictional character in his Antiquities. Josephus writes this late in the first century. So would he have wasted time in his writings on a fictitious character? I don't see that. Or at least he would have written it differently, would he have not? So James, he's writing, if Jesus, it's like when somebody is connected to some fictional character, does that make that person real or not? Well, if your ancestor is a fictional character, then chances are you are a fictional character. So if Jesus was the brother of Christ, or James was the brother of Christ, and Jesus was a fictional character, then James must have been a fictional character. And yet in the history, he's writing about this without giving some definition that, hey, these are fictional writers, and this is fictional characters. Okay, we'll stop here. Got one more thing to mention. We referenced John the Baptist. We'll read a little bit about the next, because I think there's something interesting about John the Baptist being referenced as well. Christmas, we won't be doing this next week, and I don't know what the first comes, what plans are for the first. So it might be a couple weeks before we get back into this, but at some point we'll get back in the new year at least. Well, chances are it will be the new year. So thanks so much.